Hey, today's daf, Be'ez Hashem, is daf Kuf Ayin Hey, 175 of Baba Basra, and we are starting from daf Kuf Ayin Dalid Amid Beis. We're going to start from, let's say, a little bit more than a third down of the page. It's called Moshe Bar Atzri. I don't know, this story that the Gemara is about to tell just resonates for me. I just know people like this. So what the Gemara is, we're discussing a guarantor. A guarantor. So the Gemara is discussing a guy, a rich guy, let's call him Moshe, has a son whose name is Rav Huna, who turned into a koil younger man, okay? A yeshiva guy. Hold on. Hi, Sheldon. We just began. Kufay.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So we're talking about this story. The story begins that this Moshe, this guy, rich guy, Moshe has a son, Rav Huna, who's a yeshiva man with no money to his name. And in order to get married, his father, Moshe, had to guarantee his son's ksuba. So now they're trying to figure out. You see, this Moshe probably is not giving money to his son. He wants to learn in Koilel. He's on his own. So Abaya wants to give him advice. What should he do? He should give a divorce for his wife. His wife is going to come collect the ksuba from her husband, Rav Huna. He's a yeshiva man. He has no money. So she goes back to his father, the rich guy, and collect the money. And then after she collects the money, Rav Huna should remarry her. So that's the Gemara, that's the good idea. And then he remarries her. Now he has like $100,000 for down payment for a house. So, and the Gemara is going to ask the question, wait a second, when someone guarantees a ksuba, the halacha is that before he pays the ksuba money, he has to make sure that the husband makes a neder that he's never going to remarry his wife. That's what we learned in our Mishnah. So let's see what this Gemara says. Moshe bar Atzri, Moshe the rich guy, okay? Moshe the son of Atzri. Arva de ksubasa de kalasei hava. He was a guarantor for the ksuba of his daughter-in-law. Rav Huna Brei, Surver Merabonim hava. So Rav Huna, who married his wife, was a yeshiva man. Udchika le milsa. He had no money, and his father probably didn't want to give him a dime. But to get him out of the house, he probably guaranteed her ksuba. Amar Abaya. So Abaya said, Leke de Nazel Nasbe Eitza Rav Huna. Is there no one that can give a good advice, Rav Huna? He's starving there. The Nigr Sheledvise. Let him give a divorce to his wife. Okay, let's say he gives a divorce for his wife, and now his wife says, "Give me my ksuba," but he has no money for a ksuba. V'seizel v'sivik ksuba ma'avua. Let her go collect the ksuba not from her husband, but from her rich father-in-law. Vahada nahadra, and Rav Huna should remarry her back, and that's a good way to get Rav Huna some money. Amale Rava. So Rava said to Abaya, we learned in our Mishnah that before a guarantor will pay the ksuba that he guaranteed, he has to make sure that the husband will take a neder that he'll never remarry his wife. Amalei Abaya. So Abaya said, Ati called the Megarish b'veidina Megarish. Any person that gives a get is going to Bezdin to give a get. In other words, we'll give him advice to give it to give the get in the street, and therefore Rav Huna is not in a Bezdin, so he couldn't take the neder, and his father-in-law is his father's going to have to pay the ksuba, and therefore he got around of making this neder so he could retake his wife. So the soif, and the end of the story was Igloy Milsa the Kohen, the guy missing the Kohen who, unfortunately, this Rav Huna was a Kohen. In other words, Moshe Bar Etzri was also a Kohen, and a Kohen can never take back his wife. So therefore, this advice doesn't work. So he had to remain. This Rav Huna remained destined for the rest of his life. Amar Abaya, so Abaya said, "Hani da Amar Inchi." That's why people say this a piece of wisdom. Basra Anya Azai Yusa. If following a poor person is poverty. In other words, someone who's poor has a poor mindset. You can't give him advice, if he still remains with that poor mindset. And no matter what you're going to give him advice, poverty is going to follow that person. Says the Gemara just steps back and asks a question: how could a buyer give such advice to somebody? Isn't that somebody who's considered a Rasha Aram? Mi Amar Abaya Hachi. Did Rabbi say such a thing? Amar Abaya said, Ezehu Rasha Aram, who's a crafty, evil person. He gives advice for somebody to sell possessions like Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. Basically, it's a way to circumvent situations. If you give advice to somebody to circumvent something and to get illicit profits, so then that is called a Rasha, a crafty Rasha. So how could Abaye give such advice to Rav Huna to divorce his wife, make his father pay the ksuba, and then remarry the wife? I mean, that's not a proper way of Abaye to act. And says the Gemara, really, it's not such bad advice because Moshe Bar Etzri really has a soft heart. He's just tough. Benoi Shani, for his own son, he's okay with it, even if he got fooled into giving his own son money. And also, even if it wasn't his own son, the Tzurva Merabanin Shani, he was also a good Talmud Chacham. So in the end of the day, Rabbi knew that the father would not mind if this collusion was pulled over his eyes. Says the Gemara, wait a second, how was this rich father be able to be a guarantor for his son's ksuba? The halacha is that you cannot be the guarantor for a ksuba. In other words, only if I guess if there is some sort of property owning by the husband, then you could be a guarantor to the ksuba. So let's see what the Gemara says. How could the father be a guarantor of arafu? Arav the ksuba loy mishtabed. We're going to learn later that a guarantor for a ksuba, it's meaningless. You guarantee a ksuba, you don't have to follow through. And says the Gemara, kablan hava. He was more than a guarantor. He was an unconditional guarantor. We learned that kablan is a higher form of a guarantor. And therefore, as a kablan, the father could be responsible for paying the ksuba. So as the Gemara, that would be very well according to the opinion. Kablan ksuba, if you're an unconditional guarantor for a ksuba, even though that the husband who you're a guarantor for his ksuba has no money at all, you could still be responsible. That will all make sense. But according to the opinion, only if the husband has some possessions when you guarantored, then you're responsible. But if the husband has nothing, then you can't be responsible, even if you commit yourself as a kablon guarantor. So the question is, since this Rav Huna was poor as a mouse, so then how could his father guarantee this ksuba? According to the way we're going to learn, in order to guarantee a ksuba, the husband must have some assets to his name. And says the Gemara, yeah, you're right, Rav Huna did have some assets. But again, his mazel wasn't so good. He had some assets when he got married. And it was flooded. It means a flood came in and wiped his assets away. A father to a son, even if the son has no money, he still will make himself responsible as a guarantor. The Itma, we learned, Arav the Ksuba, Arav for Ksuba. If they have no property, or even if they do, Divrei Hakol or Mishtabed, you can't be responsible for the Shibud. Now, why? I'm just going to tell it to you right now because we'll learn it later. Why wouldn't a Arav, if someone guarantees a Ksuba, be responsible? The answer is because this marriage would have happened without you guaranteeing this ksuba, because a woman wants to get married more than a man, so she would have gone into the marriage even without a guarantor. So therefore, you're not responsible. It's only when you make the loan happen that's when you become an arev. Now, kablan de bal choiv, the rabbi kol mishtabed. If you're an unconditional guarantor by a loan, then you're definitely responsible. Keep kablan de ksuba of arav de bal choiv pligi. The argument is if you're a kablan de ksuba or a regular guarantor by a bal choiv, that's the machlokes. Marsova, one opinion is if the borrower has some assets or the husband has some assets, mishtabed. But if the borrower has no assets, loy mishtabed, you're not responsible. And if the husband has nothing, you're not responsible. Marsova, Bein Islay, Bein Leslay, Mishtab. It doesn't matter. Even when they have assets or they don't have assets, you're still responsible. The Hilchasa, the bottom line of this, all these guarantors is Orev. If you want to be a guarantor to a loan, Bein Islay, Bein Leslay, whether the kid is a student or he has no assets, or even if he has, of course, Mishtabed, you're responsible. Bar Ma'arv the Ksuba. And a guarantor for a Ksuba, the Afagav, the Islay Labal, even if the husband does have assets and you're guaranteeing the Ksuba, Loy Mishtabed, you're not responsible. Why? My Tama, mitzvah hudava. You're just doing a mitzvah to make it look like the husband has friends. V'lav midei chasra. She's not losing out. In other words, she would have gotten into this marriage anyway without your guaranteeing, and therefore you're not responsible if you became an arev on a ksuba. Nu Gemara. Amar Rav Huna says, Shchiv Mera, a guy is on his deathbed. Okay, he's a rich guy. Shehigdish kol nechasav. He made all his possessions hegdish. V'amar, and then he said, Mana leplani biyadei, that a mana, 100 zuz, whatever. It's really is not my money. He said just 100. Let's say his bank account was $1 million, and he says, "Oh, 100,000 doesn't belong to me." Neman, he's believed that 100,000 doesn't belong to you. He's not making a collusion with hegdish. Basically, what's going to happen is we don't assume that he's lying, and that basically he's going to magdish everything and then just keep 100,000 back, which he's trying to secure for himself, even though he originally was magdish all his nechasim. Because let's say he magdish his nechasim on Sunday, and then Monday he says, "Oh, by the way, $100,000 that's in my bank belongs to somebody else. I was just putting it in my bank account." So then he's believed to say that, because maybe we're not going to say that he had second thoughts on the hegdish, and now he wants to call it back. So he claims that it belongs to somebody else. So we'll leave that in the account, and then he'll keep it. So maskif law Rav Nachman. So therefore, you give that mana to that whoever he says it belongs to. That 100,000, we believe it belongs to that somebody. Maskif law Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman asked the question: would we be concerned that a person would make a collusion against his own children? And the truth is that even if he says something, we don't believe him. The Rav Shmuel, the Amri Tavayu, Rav and Shmuel both said, if he said on his deathbed before he died, "Oh, the 100,000 in my bank account, even though I have $1 million, belongs to somebody else," and really that's not part of the inheritance. So if he said give it to that guy back, nice, and then we follow through. But here's the key point: if he didn't say give it back, we don't give it back, and really the whole $1 million in the bank account falls to the inheritance. We don't believe him that he said mana leplani biyade, that 100,000 belongs to somebody else. Now, then why did he say it? Why on his deathbed did he say, "Oh, I have $1 million in the bank account. You can inherit everything. Oh, by the way, 100,000 belongs to somebody else." And then he died. We don't believe him. Why don't we believe him? Because alma adam asu shalai lasbias bonam. It's very often a person will say that he doesn't want to give an ayin hara, so he wants to make sure that his kids don't look so wealthy. So he'll say, even though he doesn't mean it, that mana leplani is biyade, that 100,000 belongs to somebody else. But really, we don't believe him. So why is it that when he says mana leplani after he was magdish everything, we say, "Oh, we believe him," and when it comes to his own kids, we don't believe him? And hachinami, let's say that's Gemara finishes the question. Hachinami, when it comes to hegdish, we go to Kufay Herem Aleph. Adam Asher Shlai Lasbias Bonav, a person Lasbias Atzmai. When he was Magdish everything, we should say we don't believe him. He was Magdish everything. Why is he now coming a day later and say, "Oh, by the way, 100,000 doesn't belong to me"? He didn't want to look like this rich guy that made this big donation to Hegdish. Now it's going to say in the paper, not everything went to Hegdish, some of it went to somebody else, but really we shouldn't believe him. Answers the Gemara, the reason why we believed him by the Rav Huna's case, but not by Rabbi Yishmuel's case, the Kikomar Rav Huna Hasan, when did Rav Huna say over there that you have to believe him and follow through and give the 100,000 to the Pliny, the Naked story? That Pliny had a star, a proof that 100,000 belonged to him. Michlal, the Rav Shmuel, the Loy Nakatstari. Rav Shmuel's case was the guy is on his deathbed, and the person that he said money the Pliny Yodi has no proof that the Pliny that the money actually belongs to him. So therefore, so the Gemara asks the question, okay, Amatnu Noisten. But then if he would say the other guy that he's the Pliny has no that person does not have a document. So the guy's on his deathbed, and he says, "Money the Pliny biyadi," and so we don't believe him. But if he said Tnu Noisnim, we will give it over to that Pliny. Why would we give it over to that Pliny? Milva al, we have to give it right now, even before he dies. But that's a milva al peh. That's a verbal loan. Rav Shmuel Dami Teveu milva al peh. A verbal loan will not be able to collect, not from the Yarshim and not from the Lekuches. So if the guy died and it ends up in the hands of the Yarshim, at best it was a verbal loan. And therefore, the children do not have to follow through to pay up that loan. So why would we follow through and say Noisnin even after the person died? Answers the Gemara, El Amar Rav Nachman said, Idi Denakit. Both situations are called for that they were holding a star. And yet, in one place, when he says Mara Pliny Biyade by the Hegdish, Rav Huna said you have to follow through. Why do you have to follow through? That guy had a very good star. It was a stamped star from Bezdin that it's a good star. And therefore, the Chiddush is that even without swearing, if the guy first was Magdish all his Nechasim, and then he said, a day two later, says, oh, Mana Pliny Biyadi, and that Pliny is holding on to a star that's Makuyam, he doesn't have to swear, because the one who is the borrower or who's holding on to that, the guy on his deathbed, he said it actually belongs to Pliny, so we give it to them. Rav Shmuel's case is that they're holding on to a star. It wasn't a ratified star. So then, if he actually said Tnu, Kaimel star, so he was ratified, verified the star that the Pliny is holding on to. Loy Amatunu, if he doesn't say Tnu, Loy Kaimel star, he wasn't Mekaim the star, he didn't ratify it. So even if the other guy is holding on to the star, but the guy on his deathbed didn't say, give this guy the money, he just said, he might be right that I'm holding on to his money, but maybe he's wrong. So therefore, we don't follow through and give the money over. Omar Rabba said, but after they die, if they ratify the star, of course you have to give that money back. Omar Rabba, Nu Gemara, Shchiv Mara Sha'ama Money Plain Biyodi. Shchiv Mara says somebody has a mana leplani biyadi. I'm holding on to a mana of somebody else. It's not my money. V'amru Yisayim said Kranu. Later on, the guy died, and the Yisayim said Kranu. We paid that up. Namanim they believe they don't have to give Pliny back his money. If the guy on his deathbed said Nu mana leplani, give a mana to Pliny. I want to give him a gift, and then he died. V'amru Yisayim said Kranu. We paid the guy. Ain't nemanim. They're not believed. So now the Gemara asks, Klapi Layad, which way you're pointing to? It doesn't make sense. It makes sense to say just the opposite. If a guy on his deathbed said, I want you to give a mana to this so-and-so as a gift, so he was definitive in what he said. Even the Paske Avun Lamil. So since their father was definitive in what he said, we could believe them, the pra'eh, that they followed through what their father said. They paid the guy back. But mana leplani biyadi, if he said mana leplani biyadi, even the loip sakalovi in the mill. So since it seems on the father on his deathbed wasn't sure in what he was saying, he was said possibly that I owe somebody some money. So ikalamema, we should not believe him. The loip priori that the kids didn't pay it off because their father wasn't definitive. So if the Yisayim would say in that case we paid it off, they would not be believed. So how do you learn pshat in what Rabbah just said? If you want to say what Rabbah said, this is what you have to say. Shchiv Mara, a guy on his death, a guy on his deathbed. Sha'ama mana leplani biyode. He said, mana leplani biyode. I am holding on to somebody else's money, and then he stopped short. V'amr Yisayim said, Chazav ba'amalanu abba prati. After the guy died, the Yisraelim, the orphan said, "Oh, by the way, our father said to us that he paid it." Namanim, the Yisraelim are believed to say that the father added those words. Nobody heard it, but only the Yisraelim heard it. My tama, why? Why? Because all this makes sense. It kure mitkar. When the father said that mana leplani biyadei, he was thinking maybe I owe somebody else money. But right when he was about to die, his kids came into the room and he said, "Oh, by the way, parati," and then he died. So he probably remembered that he paid it back. So that makes sense. But tnu mana leplani, if he right away said, "Give a mana to Pliny," the amra, and then the kids come back after the father died and said, "Chazav ama abba parati," and then our father told us privately that he actually gave it already. So Einaman, and the kids are not believed. Then Isa the Pare, because if indeed he paid the guy, if he paid the mana right away, loy hava amatnu, then he would have never said tnu. When he was on his deathbed and said, "Oh, give somebody to money to a mana leplini," so he didn't remember, "Oh, I gave him already." He probably came up with this idea on his deathbed. So most likely he never gave the money to that Pliny, and therefore the assignment will not be believed to say, "Oh, our father said that he paid it up." Now the Gemara asks the question: a guy comes and says, "Oh, you owe me money," to a guy in on his deathbed, and he said, "You're right, I owe you this money." Mahu, what's the din? Does he really mean that he owes this guy money? Does he have to tell the people in the room, "Oh, you be my witnesses that I owe this person money"? Or you don't have to say, "I'm your witnesses." Now, if you're a regular person, somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, you owe me money." Even if you would say, "Oh, indeed you owe you money," you don't have to follow through and pay him. Why? Because you could always say, I was kidding around with you. The only time you would, because you could kid around with somebody or get him off your back. The only time that you would be obligated to pay is if you said to somebody, "You be my witnesses that I agree that I owe this guy money." But what about a shchimera, a guy in his deathbed, and he agrees that he owes somebody money? Does he have to reinforce what he said by saying to two people in the room, "You be by the witnesses," or maybe not? Or does he even have to say ksayvu, write it down? Normally, when you come to a healthy person and you tell him you owe me money, he has to say, if he agrees that he owes you money, and he says, "You two be the witnesses," and write it down, and write it down that I owe him the money. So that's by a normal person. But what about by a death? Are these rules waived by somebody on his deathbed? Do we believe him when he says he owes the money? And the question is like this: Adam mishata b'shas. The question to number one: Adam mishata b'shas misase. Ain't Adam mishata b'shas misase. When a person says, "I agree, I owe you money," can a person fool around with somebody right before he dies, or not? Or a person doesn't fool around before he dies. Everything that comes out of his mouth is super serious. After he made this question, Rava answered the question. A person on his deathbed will not fool around. Whatever he says, is etched in stone. You don't have to bring atam edim, and you don't even have to write it down. The divrei shchimera, when a guy is on his deathbed, the words that come out of his mouth is already kiksuvim chsurim dame. It's as if it's written and given over. In other words, it's a written and done deal. And because once you start telling a guy and asking him questions on his deathbed, and you say, "Oh, we're not going to follow through," you put him in danger, because you make him nervous right before, and you can hasten his death. So therefore, we said a guy on his deathbed, anything that comes out of his mouth, we take very seriously. We don't need to follow the normal rules of words, and his words are etched in stone because he's a shchimera. Says the Mishnah, if you lend your friend money with a shtar, you can collect from properties and put a lien on his properties. If you just have witnesses, you can only collect from freestanding properties. But if it's not written in a document, you cannot collect from put a lien on any property and recollect from properties that were sold. The Mishnah continues, another minute or two. A person took out the handwriting and says that you owe me money, then you can collect from if you pulled out, the lender pulled out from the borrower's handwriting a handwritten note that said he owes you money, then you can collect from freestanding possessions. Now the Mishnah says you have a whole document that says somebody borrowed money, and you have two witnesses sign on the document. And then after the two witnesses sign, then you have a guarantor guarantee the loan on the bottom of the page. So he didn't guarantee before the witnesses signed. Therefore, if you're collecting from the guarantor, you can only collect from the freestanding property of the guarantor. Maisa ubal lifnei Rabbi Yishmael. The story came before Rabbi Yishmael. The Oyman, he said, and that you could collect from freestanding property. Why not? He's a guarantor. Alma loy. So Banana said, you cannot collect from freestanding property or put a lien on any property. This is not even a guarantor. Because you can see, if he guarantees after the document has been signed, so he was not the cause of the loan. The loan seemed to have happened even without the guarantor. As we learned in the previous page regarding Ksuba, if something would have happened without the guarantor, then the guarantor is not considered a guarantor. Amalai, so Banana said, Shmuel said, Lama, what's your reasoning? A guy's a guarantor. Why shouldn't he be obligated to pay? Amalei, so Rabbanan explained, a guy was choking his friend in the street, and his friend saw her and said, leave him down, and I'll give you the money. Just don't choke him. We can see that the guy he just said that to get him off his back, but it's not that this loan would have happened even without this guarantor, because this loan happened even before the guy started choking the guy. What's a guarantor that you're obligated to pay? Before the loan starts, you say loan him, it's because of his trust. That's why the loan originated. So that's a guarantor. A guarantor has to be before the loan originates, then you're guaranteeing. So it's obviously the guarantor caused the loan to happen. But if the loan document was written up and then somebody guarantees, Benana says that guarantor is not considered a guarantor. Rabbi Shmuel loved the idea. Whoever wants to be smart, you should work in civil, zikim. There's no discipline of Torah, Yaisim had more than this. The Hein Kamayan Hanaveh, it's like you always learn new things when you learn Seder Nezikin. Yeah, you always learn new things in Seder Nezikin. If you want to learn Dinei Mamas, Yishamas Shimon Bananas, you should work with Shimon Bananas, because he seems to know Nezikin very, very, very well. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We're going to do the Gemara tomorrow and finish the Masechta Be'ezus Hashem.
Thank you so much.